Welcome to Grill Country. I have a guest today that I can't believe it's taken this long to get on Grill Country. But I have Hezi with me here today, who anyone who is a veteran of this little corner of the internet, the good version of this little thing of ours, uh, will probably recognize Hezi. And Hezi and I, we've interacted a lot, but we've never done it like with a camera on. And I think I've like made some comments on some of his live streams. We've interacted through the Voxer. I think he's just great, and I'm really excited for this conversation. There is no plan for where this conversation is going to go, although before I hit the record button, we were kind of working out some details on a new Grail Country project, and an interesting subject came up. But we'll see if we get around to that or not. First of all, Hezi, I know you shared your story with Paul, but I haven't heard it directly from you. So, how did you end up wandering into this little corner of the internet? How did you become a person that most people now recognize around here?
Um, Thank you for the lovely introduction. I too am a great fan of Nate, and he's been very welcoming. Well, so thank you. How did I make my way over here? So I, uh, like others around here, was noticed the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. And this to me was very intriguing because I heard uh, a lot of my traditional uh, traditional teachings of um, Judaism via its interpretation of sages over the years being spoken in a very eloquent and scientific way in certain senses, in certain cases by Jordan Peterson on a large public stage. And I saw him getting, rounds of applause for things that I've mentioned this in the past. Rabbis give sermons every Saturday in our synagogues, and people are passing out or falling asleep. And I was wondering how is this happening? How is this guy tapping in at this level to and reviving in a certain sense these texts, and very much so again with his biblical series, which was just fascinating, specifically because again these were ideas that I've heard in class growing up, but they were so boring. And here there was someone that is retelling it in such an invigorating way. So I started watching some of his stuff, um, and very quickly sort of saw Paul Vanderklay, which I thought was doing a great job, sort of taking these ideas, synthesizing them, speaking about it from like a religious perspective, which was also very interesting. At the same time, I had my own little mission, which is seeing how the meaning crisis is affecting, again, specifically Judaism in my own community. And I and still am very concerned about how what the response of Judaism will be to the ever increasing advances in technology, and the changes in the society and in culture due to that, and due to just other reasons that we've discussed here often in this little corner. So I started getting involved. I then saw this person called Jacob, and he was another Jew. And I sort of reached out to him. He put me in touch with Yosef. There was like a little conversation there, and then I sort of didn't engage anymore. I was sort of doing my own thing. And then again, like a year ago, I decided to like engage a little more, talking to Jacob and Yosef, like actually having conversations with them. And then I had eventually had a randos conversation with Paul, and got more involved like in this little corner. Really decided to take that leap when I thought that the space Jacob was
You're definitely,
specifically
by the way, you get the award for most dapper rando ever in that conversation. You're very well dressed.
in that conversation. So I was trying to, like all of us know, trying to lock down a conversation with Paul, and suddenly like I get this conversation. So I locked down the yes immediately, but it was at my niece's wedding. But I was like, this is happening. So this is like, post ceremony when they're taking pictures and there's not a lot going on. I go to my wife and like, this is happening right now. So I'm running to the car. I'm going to have a conversation and then I'm coming back. So yeah, so I was definitely dressed up. But I was mentioning specifically in Jacob's Little Corner, there was also a community building around sort of a more interfaith Noahide conversation, which also is very interesting to me, and which has a little less to do with the meaning crisis per se, and that has more to do with again more of interfaith. But that was also just looked like a beautiful blossoming opportunity to get into that conversation. So I would say that's how I got into this world. Specifically, in short, just a little about me. I live in Israel. I'm a father of three, married to my lovely wife, Jenny. She's originally from the States. I was born and raised in Israel. My parents, my mother was a teacher in a religious seminary for girls, and my father uh, is a psychologist and ran the social work and psychology program in a university in Israel for many, many years,
Mhm.
and is a writer. And my grandfather was a prominent rabbi also. And so I was very much in a house that was a blend of a lot of um, philosophy, religion, psychology, them overlapping, which was like very fertile ground for like this little corner. Jung and Freud were definitely characters that were uh I was supposed to access them just like I'm accessing the rest of the sages, as like these are people that are supposed to guide me in interpreting the text. And my father made it very clear, like just like Maimonides feels confident to quote Aristotle, my father was like, Freud, this is like, these are all people that we need to have in our toolkit when viewing these texts. Like the Bible, we need to be using these glasses, so to speak, when interpreting these texts. I was for 6 years in a theological institute for higher education, which includes a year and a half uh, stint in the Army as an officer in the Air Force, but as a chaplain, not I wasn't flying the planes. And then I went to law school. I worked as a lawyer for a year. I then quit that and opened up a design architecture firm with a partner of mine, and I've been doing that ever since, building homes, designing homes. But took a big pause from. I always studied. I always continue my studying, but I had very intense years of studying of Torah and Jewish studies, and then like really a pause of life, fathering. But this little corner, in a certain sense, really brought me back. And I mentioned this in the past that like this little corner is like a modern day Talmud, where like you have like this live version of philosophy, psychology, Bible, all being woven in and having this conversation together. So this was it was enticing, and it's been very also fulfilling. Definitely once I started this also official class that I'm doing together with Ben about Pirkei Avot, like the teachers of our sages, and I really got back sort of in that mindset of just like pure learning again, just for the sake of learning, which is it really gets me excited. I really, really enjoy it. So that's why also this specific project we're thinking of maybe moving forward with on Grail Country um, is us also very exciting for me as well. Just to find time again to sit and just learn these texts and in that sense get closer, dig deeper, exposing more and more of God's divine sparks.
So why do you think, in listening to like your kind of like explanation there, why do you think it was that Jordan, even though you're saying there's a lot of similarity between the messages that you heard in your own, in your own like growing up,
Community.
like why, yeah, in your own community, why do you think that Jordan was able to make that hit home for people, even if like, so if you're saying that there was a similarity in terms of the content, so it was just like the delivery, or what was it that made it, why do you think Jordan was having success with it where it was falling flat when you were hearing it from other places?
Great question. First off, the medium, right? The fact that it's happening on YouTube, being delivered to you, like all the world wasn't doing that up until a certain point, and specifically in Jewish communities, like uh, uh, which is like a little more traditional. You usually have like your rabbi teacher, and your rabbi is going to be engaging the text how he's traditionally taught. So you have layers of Aramaic and acronyms. So even if there's a fantastic idea, I need to go through it via different language. I need to remember, like, it gives like hints of certain ideas that I need to like tap back into. And then there's like 4 different acronyms, which means like, oh, he means this, oh, he means that. So it's not, it's sort of disruptive. Even if you are fairly well versed in that, it's still sort of chopped up in a certain sense. And you are constantly taking older ideas and then reframing them like, so what Maimonides means over here is da, 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 which today we would phrase X. So you have to, there's always like this pre-dance that you have these, these plates spinning in your head. And Jordan was sort of giving you like this beautiful packet sandwich that you can just bite into. And I think that goes down like a lot smoother. I would say like that's number one. Number two, because he's not a rabbi, there was an attempt, I think a conscious attempt to do his bottom up theory, which is like he's coming from like an evolutionary psychologist perspective over here, and he's going to try to talk to you about like hypertruths and why the lobster is connected to all this. Now, a rabbi doesn't feel the need to do this, right? A rabbi is just coming like, well, you're in synagogue, we all believe in God, so I'm just going to start from like this verse, like and you're not realizing that over the years, over thousands of years, but definitely like as the modern age has set upon us, these are questions that people have subconsciously. Like, does this still relate to it? And you could have this from, there's a guy over there that is sitting in the crowd. He's a scientist and he's listening to the rabbi speak, but he's in, it's Saturday right now, and he has like his Jewish hat on. And he's like, yeah, those things never really made sense to me with my scientist hat on, but like, I'm not necessarily going to dig too deep or push too far, or just going to listen to what the rabbi says right now. And I think he was, and if many of those questions that scientists would have, they have answers in our text, he has to dig for them, and he has to look for them, and he has to like say like, is this really what it means? It's not just, you can't just look at one line and be satisfied by that interpretation. You have to like sort of learn the topic again, and that requires effort in this busy world we live in today. So I think it's the way the message was given. I think it was done in more modern jargon, which I think also landed in a different light. And I think the credibility he landed, which is, you don't have to have this conversation using the terms angels, and you don't have to have this conversation using the using the term when we say God, like what does that mean? And in a sense, while Nietzsche did some of these elements by like sort of removing this childish or sort of the man in the sky God version we had, I think Jordan was reviving that idea, but from like, again, from like a scientific perspective. And I think that was very very, I mean, that was very alluring to a lot of people to try to gain access to God through that route. And hence there's been in the Jewish community now, after a few years, and beginning, people are like, who is this guy? Now, if you talk to, let's say, any rabbis that are aware of him, will call him like a modern day Jethro, or he is like a righteous Gentile, but like he is being looked at favorably. Like this guy's like, they're like, yep, this guy's like totally legit. He's doing like God's work. Great, good. They have their own comments with regards to like his take on Christianity and things like that. But generally speaking, people are very, very pro Jordan Peterson. Now, there are circles where you can get what Jordan's teaching in abundance, and and those people have that access. But I would say to the younger generation out there, it would behoove many rabbis in like institutions that I studied at to really take some notes and see how you want to reintegrate that into your teaching method.
So, so generally, at least from in your context, at least in Israel, I guess we can say that the reception of Peterson has mostly been positive by religious people. Is that or
I
not?
mean, he came to speak here. I went to his speech over here, and it was packed, sold out immediately, and you had a mixture there of like secular and religious. No one that was really ultra orthodox went there, even though some of him know him as well, but that there I would say that's even more conservative. But the guy was getting standing ovations. People were just eating up everything he was saying. Um, So yeah, he was well received, and Israel itself being a more conservative country, 12 Rules for Life, both 1 and 2, did very well over here. People are maps the meaning less so. Um, Also in Israel, there's a connection to Jung via Eric Neumann, his student, who happened to move to Israel and was like lived here.
Right.
And I mean, Jordan is a huge fan of Eric Neumann, who has a fantastic book about the origin of Jewish consciousness, which is a fantastic 2 volume book. So again, like some of those concepts sort of already in the air in Israel, if you were following sort of like any Jungian conversation. But yeah, he was well received over here.
So so Jung is generally, you would say, in Israel, even in religious circles, held in fairly high regard.
Mm,
Because it's definitely like I'm just this is an interesting contrast because I'm listening to you and I'm trying to figure out like why there are lots and lots of Christian scholars, Christian academics, Christian theologians who not are not as big on Jung, that view Jung in a much more negative light, and consequently have a much more negative view of Peterson and Peterson's biblical series. And what I'm trying to do is I want to I want to see if I can maybe not pinpoint, but at least get if we can like maybe move towards some idea of figuring out like, well, why is that? Why is there more positive reception?
Jesus is the reason. He's
Okay,
not Jesus heavy.
okay, okay.
Right? There's no fear of like Jesus smuggling, so to speak, from where like so anyone listening from Jewish ears, they're very comfortable thinking like, he hasn't defined himself as like Christian necessarily. So like all this conversation is really, as far as we're concerned, it's all kosher, right? There's no like push over here for us to be like, okay, like I mean, it was very important for my father that I read Kierkegaard. And definitely, if you want to understand, like the Abraham and Isaac, and with the whole story over there, but uh, but but then you still have to constantly deal with like their take on Christianity or their take on now Jordan. To be fair, I would mention to my brothers, like, you should let my nephews watch Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson Wave 3, right? When he came with his new series, there was a lot more Jesus talk. And I then told my brothers, you should be more sensitive what you're letting them watch right now with this wave, just because well, I'll give an example which relates. Matthews Peugeot's book, Language of Creation. Right. So I'm a big fan of a lot of the ideas in that book. I know you have your whole conversation with like Jonathan, your tweets, them not responding. I know there's like a whole drama there, but uh,
No,
either
my kid actually follows me on Twitter, which is not nothing because he only follows like 50 people. So
right, and I know he has like I've heard like some little comments about him and his brother's ideas, and his brother mentioned like, no, these are my brother's ideas. Either way, um, my nephew was like, oh, I want to have this book. And I was like, yeah, but it's not like this book is not relevant for you to have like in your theological school right now, because they're not going to take well for you having like this book by this Christian guy. Like it's too soon for you to be playing with that. And I could see that being very confusing to my nephews with how Jordan talks about Jesus without them having the proper uh, groundwork done to be
grounding in
able
their own
to
tradition first. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I think earlier, I think that's why he was more well received, because there wasn't a sense of any attack on, let's say, Judaism per se, and we weren't hearing someone that's like champion right now, let's say, go Christians, rah rah. There was just someone talking about Bible and God, and from a affirming scientific perspective. I think that was what allowed him to sort of like skip to the front of the line.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's certainly like, well, in North America, well, maybe I shouldn't say North America, in the United States, because Canada is a whole separate issue at this point, a whole separate kettle of fish at this point.
Right.
But at least in the United States, like the the dominant strain of Christianity in the United States is still like Protestant evangelical Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an anti-intellectual bent to that strand of Christianity. There just is. And there has been for a long time. So I'm like, and I don't know if it's like, I get what you're saying about he doesn't talk about Jesus, but I think there might be like, there's something else that I think is at maybe even a layer deeper than that about why Jordan has found better reception amongst Jews in Israel than amongst, like, well, I mean, he, like, there's a lot of evangelicals like him, but they like him for his politics. They don't really
So the
like him for his
politics
biblical
conversation,
series.
I would say, like people care about less about that in Israel. First of all, just because like the woke insanity do, hasn't really been integrated in Israel. That's because we would have most Israelis would have zero patience for
Right.
that. And um, it's not that people are not I guess maybe they're less sensitive, but just there really is no one's going to be playing with any ideas of pronouns. Like people would get very upset if you tried to do that with them. They'd be like, why on earth did you just like, and not to try to be like offensive, as like, like not because they don't want to respect you. They'd be like, what on earth is happening right now? Like, why are you like, what
Mm-hmm.
now? There obviously needs to be a conversation in Israel where people need to be like more conscious and more understanding, and how to and more accepting. But I'm just saying like that. So I think that part of Jordan is less appealing to them, like the culture wars. Um,
Right, but I'm saying for American evangelicals, I think that's what kind of holds them, because they don't, when it comes to the actual content of his biblical series, like if you read what a lot of Christian commentators have to say, it's like, yeah, I like Jordan Peterson, but the biblical series not so much. Like they really don't like the way he approaches the Bible at all. And I think that like, and I think there, and here's the thing, I think that it has to do with Judaism being a tradition that emphasizes orthopraxy over orthodoxy, like by its nature,
Yes.
and Christianity being like very, very, like, at least like in the post-Reformation and definitely in the modern age, it's very much like very hyper concerned with what you believe. So
Right.
that
Very
means,
much not the concern in Judaism.
right. And so that means like the way you read the text, if there's any sense that you're reading the text the wrong way at all, that's going to cause an immediate negative reaction from a good chunk of Christians, even though they generally like Jordan Peterson and they like a lot of other things that he has to say, but they do kind of cringe a little bit when he talks about the Bible. A lot of them.
It's
And Paul's kind of unique in not feeling that way.
interesting that, like, that I'm saying that as you're saying that I could hear that. I mean, like, he's standing and speaking in Jerusalem, right? And he's looking at the Israelis there, and he's saying that uh, it all stems from here. It's hard to, like, you guys are like the shining castle on the hill, and like all the eyes are looking up to you. Like, there's no way he's saying that in Spain. You know what I mean? Like in his Spain tour, going to the Spaniards, I mean, like everyone's looking at Spain. So like, it's obviously very strange to see like this public intellectual come and tell us Jews, like, you guys are fantastic. This is amazing. But like,
But again, but look, listen to what I just said about how Judaism's emphasis on orthopraxy, and then look at like Peterson is like philosophically, he's a pragmatist. He's a pragmatist in his core, like he is like a pragmatist in the great tradition of American pragmatism, without a doubt. Like that's his orientation. So,
right,
um,
but that's like you said that, Matt. I mean, the 12 rules for life, right? So let's say in the discussion, Cal was having a little stream earlier, and he was asking about, you know, are Jews loved more than other nations and other people? And he felt that like all nations are loved, have like a unique relationship with God. And I was writing in the comments how, this will relate back to 12 rules for life, but that God loves, I believe God loves all his creations. And I also believe, and I think this is backed up by our sages as well, that with regards to individuals, the Gentile, whether slave, woman, or man, black or white, could reach highest levels, even higher than the high priest. Okay, it doesn't have to be Jewish. There's a difference with regards to the collective Jewish people, and with their discussion with God about, like, you know, be holy from us because I'm holy. And that invitation is, there are routes to connect to God. One would be like as in his wisdom through science, philosophy. One would be through revelation, his will. And the Israelites get invited to, do you want to dance with me? Do you want to converse with me via my will through prophecy and take on the crown of holiness, which is an aspect of me, God, I am holy. Would you like to be holy as well with me, for a different level of conversation as a collective? That requires, though, the yoke of embodiment of this practice, of these rules, of this operating system. We can discuss whether or not it needs to be updated and how that update looks. But do you want to take on this operating system? It comes with, for all intents and purposes, 613 rules.
mhm.
And that's the game. So if you have 12 rules for life, you know, if I'm looking as a Jew, obviously there's a discussion about you know, what I should be believing in. But generally saying, we'll get to that in a moment. When you wake up in the morning, this is the shoe you put on first. This is how you wash your hands. This is how you make your blessing. And it's very, 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 very structured. And that is because whether or not you believe in God, you are tapping into an operating system, which, if done properly, ideally, will allow you to, we'll use a term that's used today, but will allow you to live a mindful life. And living a mindful life with your shoulders back and your room being clean and being oriented properly, seemingly would allow you to live a righteous life where you are aware of God and you are aware of your surroundings and you are aware of what is above you. So I think that does very much speak Peterson's language.
Mhm.
And
Well, look at how he
and for,
talks about look about how he talks about faith, right? Which, like, to me, like in my own personal journey, like that's like I grew up Pentecostal, and like I struggled with understanding what the concept of faith, and even really I never really felt I had a grasp on what faith was.
Mhm.
And there was something when I first heard Jordan Peterson define faith, and when he insisted on, like, no, you see a person's faith in what they actually act out. Like that's where you see where someone's faith is. Like that would, to me, that like aligned with the intuition I had always had. So you can see, but there's like the majority of Christians, like I'm talking about Christians in the United States, within the strains of Christianity that dominate the United States, they're very much like hyper focused on, no, it's about like what you believe in terms of holding the right propositional beliefs. And this is something that I think like all of this little corner the is collectively challenging that idea. And that's why there are a lot of Christians who don't like what we're doing.
I guess I'm a little deaf to that, just because like
Right.
I mean, again, that's not like my circles. Obviously, what you're saying makes sense with why there would be this interest in Vervaeke and his embodiment programs, and like I'm saying, really to try to make really see about it's all about the practice at the end of the day. Um, but I do get a sense that in this little corner, right, there's like this. It seems like from the outside, like you're saying, the majority of Christians would be bucking up against this, which is why this little corner is so interesting to me. Because as a Jew, I'm like, this is like Six Flags. Like
Well,
this is
this
like
is
amazing.
why I think you see that this is why you see, like, I mean, Paul is Protestant, and I mean, we have Protestants, but I mean, if you look around the corner and you see where people are, there's a lot more people in this little corner. A lot of more of the Christians are in some sort of traditional liturgical tradition that is defines less things, right? So like limits itself more to the traditional creed, is more concerned with practicing liturgy in the right way, those kinds of things, and is more open to this like less propositional means of the spiritual path, of the path to God.
So I guess it'd be interesting. So like when I'm speaking to Jed or you or Luke or Sherry or Jess,
Oh, you cut out on me.
when I'm
Oh,
speaking,
okay. Now I can hear you.
when I'm speaking to Luke or you or Jess or Jason or Sherry, so like you're saying like that's like a very bad sampling though of Christians, because like you're getting like a very specific.
I think you know that we're kind of weird, right?
No, I understand that, but like in my mind, it's like there's like beautiful like yes, there's disagreements here and there, but I would say like there's usually like a beautiful flow of conversation where everyone's like we're totally on the same boat, and that's not the sense like in the real
I
world.
think my
Where,
mom is much more representative of like the typical like American Christian like engagement with um interfaith dialogue. And so like, so for whatever reason there's like very much, and this is a thing to me, this is a fashion of this moment of history that I think could fade. And I'm seeing like there's a wave of really disturbing anti-Semitism that's like creeping up within, even within those traditional, actually maybe even especially within those traditional Christian circles that I was just talking about. Like I can see the undercurrent like starting to swell up. But within the dominant like evangelical tradition that is most representative of the Christianity of the United States in this moment in history, there's a sort of just like a caveat that's like carved out for Jews, where it's like it's all about, yes, for them it's like all about like believing the right things, but God doesn't break his covenants, so Jews get a pass. Jews are okay. But it would really be better if they believe the same thing we do. And they
Right.
would definitely celebrate the conversion of any Jew to believing the way that they do. But
I mean,
they don't think Jews but they don't think Jews are evil or going to hell. And so there's like this sort of exception into their general worldview that's carved out and that's shaped specifically around Jews. If you're Muslim, you're SOL. Like they don't wouldn't give you that same grace.
there are implications to that. Like when in 2015, the when the Vatican comes out and says that Judaism or Jews don't require salvation through Christ, that's like a huge, I mean, that has big implications to how we see Christians potentially doing like, are Christians still considered
Yeah,
Noahites,
but
for
look at
example?
how the evangelicals look at post Vatican II Rome. Like they like I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but like I will tell you, like there is a loathing, even like there's a loathing of like the post Vatican II Rome's move toward a more conciliatory ecumenical, like that is despised within a lot of the more hardcore traditional Catholic circles. That's viewed negatively. It's certainly not something that has carried over into large swaths of American Orthodoxy. Like there's never been any move within Orthodoxy to make that same kind of conciliation that was made in Vatican II by the Roman Catholic Church. And I just described the evangelical view. But I wouldn't take too much comfort in that because it just seems to be historical fad, and I could see it turning in a moment.
Well, that's, I mean, my what's interesting to me, again, in this little corner, and I also mentioned this to Paul back in the day, but 1948, the Bible becomes alive again, right? Like here comes like these Israelites, and like they're here again, and you have to sense like the world are like, this chapter was like wrapped up like a long time ago, and now again, this is here, and I think that put everyone in like an awkward position. It also puts like Israel in an awkward position. Our sages tell us that the Israelites are shy, and that's like a negative because like we're always constantly trying to give reasons and explanations like why God created us and why we're here. You don't hear China trying to say like we want the right of like self determination. Only like Israel is like, do we really have a right to exist? Should we really be over here? I'm putting aside like the political question. Just we should be more confident with who we are. Either way, um, this sense of, let's say, anti-Semitism, or like clearly it's a new world out there. What is the Vatican going to say, right? Post Holocaust, how are they going to deal with like this? So obviously there's a lot of that there, but I also think and believe that as far as the world's concerned, post 1948, it's Jews either be miraculous or just disappear. Like it's too much for the world to handle. Like, and I think that's a lot of where that anti-Semitism stems from as well, which is like, we don't know what to do with you.
Mm.
There's, you're sort of riding a long history. Uh, you're now back in this tiny little country that requires so much attention from this world when there's other stuff going on, which are important stuff going on, and yet we keep on getting dragged back into the nonsense stuff you guys are dealing with in your little country, which is a statistical error with regards to, let's say, the population census in China, we're like nothing. So I think there's a sense, and I feel this tension internally as well, which is we need to show what a integrated individual slash family member slash community member slash city member slash full body politic all the way up, how that looks like. And that is not supposed to be that everyone in the world needs to copy our model or do what we're doing. It's supposed to be how orientation like that looks. And we are, while Israel has done fantastic stuff, and I think like these are the crumbs. Like the fact that we're a startup nation, that's nothing. That's like great, awesome. That there's a lot of talent over here. We can do a lot of stuff. I believe we have a much greater message to give. And I think the world, in a certain sense, senses that, but is very, expectations have not been met yet. And I guess it's sort of a question to
Well, but
you.
Christianity is suffering from the same thing, though, right?
No,
Because like,
no doubt.
so like it's like in the like the kingdom has not been delivered by either. There's a
Then
failure.
there is more pressure than on, because arguably I would say Islam, it being Yishmael's son and its promise, what it needed to do, become a great nation and promulgate one God, been doing a great job doing that so far. Really pushing monotheism. They take it very seriously. Definitely don't draw Muhammad. They get very upset. So they've been doing their thing. Christians and Jews, while Christianity by some major sages has been seen as like the path maker for Messiah, and at times gets shed with a good light as well. We're both sort of need to reconcile with the fact that we can't both be Israel, and we are clearly both not going anywhere. So we have to see how this body gets reintegrated. And I've used the term before about two different hands at one body that need to realize how they're folding in with each other. There are concepts in mysticism, Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, which talks about Islam being the left hand of God. There's too much justice and rights. The right hand being Christianity, which is too much love, and Israel being in the middle, which would be, according to the spheres, would be the Tiferet sphere, glory, which is like a combination of both of these things together. But I think we're past the conversation of, who's the right religion, so to speak. Like, it's the house of prayer for all the nations, and there's room for I can't see Christianity disappearing and Islam disappearing. I think it's an adult conversation where all these religions need to start having, okay, what's what, and where are these terms similar, where do these terms differ, and if where they differ, we need to dig down deeper and be like, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not understanding what this term means, or maybe this
Right, and
is
that
what.
means that spirit of ecumenicism that that Vatican II expresses is like it's not something that like we can do without. And I think it's like and it's like there are big portions of the Christian world that have a huge problem with that. A huge problem with that. And that are still very much invested in like, no, 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 like we are the one true church. And when they say that, they usually mean their own particular idiosyncratic denomination is the one true church.
I mean, this is the joke. When there's like a poem, someone wrote about it as well. Like when Messiah comes, and he comes into the synagogue, he's like, "I'm here, guys," and they're like, "Well, you're not wearing like a black hat." He's like, "Okay, I'll go to like the Orthodox." Like, I'm here. They're like, "Well, the skull cap you have on is like sort of like the wrong color." So at some point, he's like, "You guys are not ready for me," and he bounces and he leaves. And I joke about this because my mom is very much like the type of person that if Messiah came and he was giving his speech, she would be like, it's gonna be prayer time soon. So maybe you're gonna like, wrap this up. Like I don't think she'd be able to control herself. And like
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
so but I use my mom as an example. I have introduced her over the years, or let's say, or exposed her to a lot of this more ecumenical sort of kind of conversation, and even within our own text. And she understands that. She tells me like, Hezi, that wasn't the conversation then. It was after the Holocaust, and like what was going on, and we were just we lived in a different generation, and I'm sympathetic to all of that. and when Paul talked about like the winsome wars, again, it strikes a chord, and strikes close to home in Israel, because there is a big minority in Israel that has a tremendous amount of political power, who are, for all intents and purposes, is how Israel represents Judaism, which is like Judaism of Europe in a very specific time and place. And there's like a lot of pushback over there, but that's happening on the ground. Like, I have this, in a certain sense, the words of the prophets have already been manifesting themselves over here, because I see the old couple sitting at the park watching little kids play, just like the prophet said would be. So that's like amazing. On the other hand, from a zoom in perspective, I'm so far away still from those end of days, or the world to come, because how Judaism is being represented right now is a very specific version, a much more conservative version that's in many cases pushing down religion through policy down the people's throat.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, we're very far away. And in Israel right now, politically, a lot of its tensions also are because of that as well. You have this group in Israel which doesn't participate as much in the national army service, and doesn't. A lot of the students and children don't study English, math, some of these basic core stuff, because they have their own system. However, they still require funds from the government, and they're participating less in other ways. They participate more in different ways, but it's a problem where you have like a growing population that has like an average of like 5 to 6 kids, which is not as educated, not serving in the army. Now their claim is like, we're learning the Torah, and that's like keeping this whole thing spinning. So like, what do you want from us? There's only so much you could require from a secular and even a traditional secular group to sort of take that on. And then you have a real problem, because then you have like the secular in the country being like, well, then I'm pushing back against this religion. And I'm there being like, well, that's not really what we represent necessarily. And on the flip side, when there's this pushback about like, well, we could be like culturally Jewish, but like, that's it. If all you want to be is culturally Jewish, then you very quickly you start being in a problem again, where like you are an occupier, because you are an occupier then. Like, with regards to Palestinians, like, it's in the name, it's Israel. Like, the reason we're here is because we believe Abraham walked over here. And if you don't think that, then don't be here, because it's a very hot place. The taxes are very high. But if you're part of like a greater story, if you're here, as we have in our declaration, which is like, following with like the footprints of the prophets, if you're going to take those words seriously, then you're part of a bigger story. And like, it's a problem when you have like Israel being a Jewish democratic state. It's Jewish while participating in the democratic game which we live in today, but that's not because democratic is the end-all be-all religion that we believe in. Rather, that's the best system we have right now to allow us to push forward these concepts. And I believe, unlike Christianity, and it's very apropos with this week's portion, the 5th book, the book that Moses is a lot more involved in writing. We have 4 books talking about like all these different rules, and then we have this 5th book, which is really all this is supposed to manifest and culminate in the land. And I think in Judaism, the conversation is very much God oversees everything, even what Caesar sees, even the politics. God very much wants us to be involved in the politics as well. And there's a sense of yes, there's a divine conversation, but don't litter. And you need a political system, and you need cops, and you need teachers. All of this is because we want to live in a righteous world, and God is expecting that as well. So, like, I am very much a social warrior. Let's clean that from all its baggage. I'm saying like an old school social warrior is definitely what God is expecting from us, which we see in the concepts of like no interest, or like the Jubilee year.
Well, that's kind of like that actually is implicit from I don't know if you remember the Robert Jensen essay that I shared with you a while back, toward a Christian theology of Israel. And that was actually like one of the points that he makes, is that like whatever the church is, it is not in this dispensation, it is not a nation, right?
Right.
Israel is a nation. So those concerns that you're talking about are appropriate for a nation. The church, I think, doesn't have those. The church is something different altogether, and is pointing toward a kind of more revolutionary means of living together that the world isn't necessarily ready for yet, because the kingdom is still being prepared.
So I think that works well with what I was saying right now, also about like the no interest, which is these are utopian models in a certain sense, where we haven't stepped up to the plate. Like that only works, like you just said, within a community. So usually Judaism gets lambasted for our Bible discussing the concept of slavery, right? And we're like, up in arms about this. How is this happening? But if you look at how we interpret slavery, the attitude is someone just stole from you or harmed you or caused damage to your property. Sure, we could send him to jail where he could get more. We could get locked into that cycle of violence, and who knows if he's even going to be able to make it out. Instead, we're going to have the family adopt this person, and they're going to make sure if there's no food in the house, he gets food first, and if there's no beds in the house, he gets a bed first, and we're going to have this person realize what it is he's missing out on and how important it is to be part of this community and family. That's what it means when it says slave. That's very different than like, we're whipping someone right now or asking them to work in the fields per se. And we get to a place where like, what happens when the slave wants to stay with you? He doesn't want to leave. And eventually you have to like make a hole in his ear and you have to let him go.
That actually points toward a different understanding of freedom too, right? Because in that context, the person is a slave because it's a person who's not yet ready to be free, because they haven't understood how to properly live in community as a free person yet.
Correct. But we're thinking about a society in that way, like how crazy it would be if we lived in a world where people were willing to take in criminals and be like, we'll rehabilitate them as part of the community, we'll rehabilitate them. And then you're like, okay, wow, we're not there yet, but would be amazing if that's what we're expecting from the community to take on. And for you to look at your son and be like, yeah, well, you're sleeping today in the attic because like, the smuggler's living with us today. And for your son to understand, of course we're doing that, because love thy neighbor as yourself. And that's clearly where I'm going to see God manifest again eventually through it, right? Like Jacob sees in Esau, even though all their intense relationship, ultimately he says, I saw Kiraiti Pnei El, I saw the face of God in you. And we must see the humanity in one another. In the States, it's a little more difficult because I don't know if you feel like the man in Texas is your brother. And in Israel, it's very much the sense is the guy up north or the guy down here, we're all very much one family. And there's that sense. Now we are still not, I don't think we're proving that model yet. But that's where I think there's a tension when the world looks at us being like, then do it. Be
Right.
the people.
Well, and the church very much has like the same sort of like the church is definitely envisioned as a family. That's why, like, this is especially obvious in the traditional churches, because it's like that's why you call a priest father, right? That's why the heads of orders for women are called mother, right? That's why we call each other brother and sister. It's like it's a familial model that is being looked at. And this is like, I mean, this is like one of the reasons that I'm a Christian anarchist, is like the model of the model of organization and living together that church is clearly pointing toward in all of its understanding of itself, is actually not based on the polis at all, but on the household. It's seeing the world as the household of God. Like that's the church. The church's vision is supposed to be the world as the household of God, and which is different from a polis.
This isn't a family, but ultimately the Talmud has a discussion of like where is God's Shekhinah, let's say it's a feminine attribute of God, but where can it sit? And it talks about like a family. It ultimately boils down to between two people, right? I mean, this relates also to like the dialogos, but like that's where it's happening between that interaction, which would be let's say the smallest version of family, and in the human body, more or less, we have this symmetry, right? We have our eyes, our nose, our ears. There's like the symmetry going all the way across. The one place where we don't have this symmetry would be in our heart,
You cut
right?
out
Where
a
our
little
heart
bit.
is shifted to the left. And the only time we'll have a symmetry is if you're hugging another person, if you're embracing another person, then both hearts are symmetrical again because there's space for either one to have that. And that's how you create that completion, which you also have when God creates Eve, right? He sees that it's not good that the man is alone. And then he creates a help against him. And this is again to create to create the symmetry. I need to create someone that's going to be looking against you, but managing to assist you and complete you in that way. So it sounds like a cliche, but very much like I complete you is what's necessary. You can't do this alone. And so for sure there has to be that sense of family over there. Um, and I think we lose that in today's world where everyone's like really locked up, siloed away in their phone. This was exacerbated obviously with Corona, which is why Grimm and specifically Paul, really talking about embodiment and community and relationship, and even why the Estuary Project I think is like a uh very important project because that
And
is really allowing you to.
a very ecumenical project. I mean, and I think there's people in these quarters that like they don't that's what they don't like, right? I don't know why they hang around. That's what I haven't figured out
So
is
what
like
do they
why do
want?
the like I have like there's this guy that harasses me on Twitter all the time who clearly follows TLC because he knows the names of like everybody involved and will make specific criticisms of everyone. But like he was one of the people who was piling in this is Paul a leader conversation, and he was like, what, leading toward what, some sort of like amorphous spiritual consensus or something like that, because he's one of those like newly converted Orthodox that like just has this very strong sense of like no, the Orthodox Church is the one true church in a very very literal and narrow sense, and we should all be about like getting everybody to become Orthodox. And if that's not what Paul is doing, then he's not leading. And
Right,
I
but
just
like you just said, what are they doing here? Because at any point, you just don't have to. You don't have to watch any of this, right? You don't have to see any of this. You don't have to. You don't
right.
have
So
to
I'm
engage.
wondering why they hang around. But do not. I don't want that to be construed as a get the hell out because I don't. I'll talk to anybody. If this person wanted to come on Grail Country and talk to me and tell me why I'm wrong, sure, no problem. I'll talk to anyone. That's not my. So my point is I'm just curious as to if you think that way, what is keeping you engaged with something that you are recognizing as about something very different from what you want? Why do you stay
So
engaged with it?
I think it's more a sense of insecurity when you're hearing ideas that are challenging yours. You just want this little corner to disappear. I don't need to be thinking about like I'm hearing things over here that are challenging me and make me feel uncomfortable. And instead of ignoring it, I would really rather just go away. And I'm just gonna keep on bashing it. Where you know, if it turns into the amorphic nothing, then I was right. That this was like nothing, and like I could like feel validated in my beliefs. I think when seeing someone like Paul,
But isn't it?
again, to me,
But is a space where people who are on different, who are themselves dedicated to their own tradition, but want to have a space where they can talk to people that are in other traditions. Like, how is that a nothing?
so Agreed, because I could say even if what came out of everything Paul did was this conversation, I would be like, it was worth it. Like this happened right now. So like I'm with you that he's like by Paul not leading, right? He's created this thing. There's been already selling in Germany. There's thing being selling in China. There's clearly something being built. There's clearly something happening. I can tell you that like I've benefited personally from this little corner, just like I mentioned, like just these. If it's just these kind of conversations or these Voxer groups, which allowed me to challenge myself and think deeper and wider about these topics. So I mean, really, to me, so it's funny when I hear people like hating on this because I don't know where else you're supposed to be. You're supposed to see a group of a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, and a Sikh having a conversation together, and no yelling, no one losing their shit. Like it's gorgeous.
Yeah, and
So
no one's
I
trying to
think
and no one's trying to convert anyone either. Like it's just like it's just and everyone and it's like, people are being like faithful to the perspective of their own tradition in these conversations too.
but is there growth? I mean,
Yeah, I think so because they're like I think like I mean there
let me.
are go ahead.
I was gonna say, like in the last, let's say, X years that you've been involved in this little corner, how has your understanding of your own religion and your relationship with Jesus changed?
Okay. So, well, this requires me to tell some of my own story, I suppose. Okay. So, I I wouldn't have found my way back into my own tradition if it wasn't for like because and I'm actually not like I mean I'm Christian still. I was raised Pentecostal. I'm not a Pentecostal anymore. And at some point in my early 20s I had an intellectual conversion to Catholicism, which was an intellectual conversion, and intellectual conversions have a tendency to not hold because they're they're built too much on those idea castles, and there's always a better argument. There's always a better argument if everything that you believe is based on some kind of argument and that's all that it's holding it together. Eventually it's going to crumble because there's an argument that you're not prepared for that you'll come across that will make the whole castle like fall down. So um and it was it was really like it wasn't just Jordan, but Jordan was a factor in making me rethink. Like again, I told you I had my whole life this question of like what faith even is. And like Jordan's the way Jordan talked about faith and the way he related faith to like how you actually act in the world, demonstrating more about your faith than what you say you believe in. Like that was like a key for me that I needed. I was also reading a lot of David Bentley Hart at that time, and but this one like, and it was really Barfield that ultimately like caused me to like go through an entire paradigm shift in terms of like how I look about everything. But uh yeah, so I probably would have just remained like a like spiritual but not religious kind of agnostic person had it not been for this little corner. Like I just like wouldn't have found my way back. So I was someone who was always interested in philosophy of religion, philosophy. I always liked Jung. I was a big Joseph Campbell fan from like my teens. I love mythology, I love folklore. But I had a problem with the propositional belief structure. So I had to find a non and I'd already gone through the propositional route and then deconstruct it. So I needed to find a non-propositional way back into my own tradition.
Right. So I guess that's what's interesting because like, like it's not like you a few years ago you were like not well read, right? You read the
Right.
books,
Exactly.
you like
Yeah.
you looked at the stuff. So I guess
Yeah.
so I mean, again, that's why when I'm
And I also need, there's one other person I need to get credit for. Like like when I first met my wife, I was still an agnostic. And my wife was not. My wife is like she was a practicing Jew. She believed in God. She was a person of faith. And so definitely like being close at being that close to someone who is a person of faith, I mean, obviously that has an impact too, right? So definitely my wife is an influence. But I mean, it was my own tradition that I found my way back into.
but so when you're having, let's say, a discussion in a Vox, for example, and this is why when I say like the modern day Talmud, because I my sense is you get to like drop in a topic, and then like it's different than you reading it in your book and being like, wow, like I sort of understand it. I do understand it like on one level, but now I drop it in and I suddenly get pushback from Yosef and Chad writes it like in poem form, and you're like, I didn't think about it that way. And then Jerry comes in, and then you're like, this became so much more alive and so much more
I
real.
love that you're calling it a kind of Talmud, because that is really, yeah, because it is, it's definitely what it is like it's one big ongoing continuous conversation. And just like the Talmud, there's arguments. Like there's not we don't agree with each other all the time. We're working it out. We're doing the best we can. But you know what there is though is there is a shared vision of truth that I think is not limited to propositional truth, because if it were, then I don't think we would be able to have some of the conversations that we have. So I think there's a shared vision of like whatever truth is, it's not confined to this propositional layer. Like that like whatever truth is, it looks something more like being in right relationship with reality than it is about holding the right set of propositions.
Yeah, well, it's never going to be what I perceive, right? I gave this example to my kid about how dogs see, like, they smell and see the smell in a certain sense. They'll see like this tube of color. And I was explaining to him how this dog would find you because we can't. I'm like, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means we don't perceive it, right? We don't see the infrared. We don't see the ultraviolet. It's there. And again, it is really, I think when we start having these conversations, we start getting hints of, okay, there are other beams of light going on over here. There are radio frequencies that we can't tap into. Um, and as far as the ecumenical conversation, so this is something that I've discussed, but it really helped me with my framing, sort of um, growing up. That there, Abraham is known in our tradition to give the concubine's sons, or his kids, as a not Isaac, but the other kids, he gives them these gifts. And we are told in our tradition that he goes to the Far East, and this is where he gives them these gifts. And there's a whole play on words that like Brahma is Abraham backwards, and this is when the first Vadas are being written out. But in our tradition, the Eastern religions are seen as, we call them tum'ah, which is like unholy, but not because they're wrong. They're just unholy for us Jews, which would be, I give the example of, I relate to God via FM radio. That doesn't mean AM radio doesn't exist. It's just not my frequency. It's not related to my
Right.
frequency.
Yeah.
But I would say traditionally, Jews grew up, not that the sages didn't say this, just like they didn't have access to
Not only
this.
that, it is the frequency to which you have across generations been fine-tuned to receive, right? So that the
Correct.
idea that you could somehow transform yourself to you're a person that primarily is connecting through the AM signal doesn't make any sense. Like you're fighting against, in some ways, you're fighting against your own nature. I have
So
this is a conversation I had with Donnie at at the Chino conference, where it's like I was talking to Donnie and it's like I finished his sentence for him because he was talking about like why he went like why he went back to his own tradition. I said because it and I said it's because it's yours. That's why I
right.
went back. Right? It's because it's yours.
I
Like
had
where else would you go? Like why would you try to go somewhere else?
so I had Zevi from Secrets of Unity. I had him like over for, let's say, a more intimate conversation with like 30 different people at this house. And we were having a discussion. And at some point someone was like, well, it sounds like you're saying, Zevi, that all these different mystical traditions are all a relevant root. Like they're all legit. And he's like, yeah, they are. And there was pushback. We're like, okay, but what about like the Jews? We're the chosen people. He's like, yeah, they all think they're chosen. They're like, right. But so he then said, he's like, listen, this is your tradition. So it's going to be the easiest way for you to tap
Yeah,
in is going
right,
to be
exactly.
now. Yeah, he's like, if you're that one guy that's really lost and you decide to go on the top of the hill and you want to do Kundalini yoga and you get to Nirvana, then great. You did
Yeah.
it. That's also around. It's just going to be much more difficult for you to do that.
Yeah. There are people who feel ill fitted to whatever that has been given to them by nature, right?
Right.
Right. They don't feel fitted to it. And for those people, so I'm not saying if you're a California Buddhist who grew up in a completely Christian context, but for whatever reason that stopped working for you, and you found a path that is bringing you into a right relationship with reality through Buddhism, more power to
Right.
you.
So that's where, like, that would be a conversation where officially, right, the answer is like, you do what the Jews do. And then, like, if this was my son, I'd be like, okay, having said that, as long as you're being legit, sincere, then yeah, like, and that relates to when I was a child. There's the famous story of Bilam, right, on the donkey, and the donkey speaks. And as a child, I'm like, 1 second, why is this Gentile having a conversation with God? Like, how is that happening? Like, I thought like we are the ones having the conversation with God. Who's this dude? And the attitude is like, yeah, there's a whole other, everyone else is also having the conversation with God. Other people have their narratives. This is your narrative. This is your story, but there are other
And
stories.
conversation is the right way to frame it too, because it points back to that like relational dialogical structure. It just seems to be like that's how it unfolds.
And the Silk Road seems to be mysticism.
It seems to be what?
Mysticism.
Yeah, mysticism. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So I mean, we don't have to get into the whole question of like, whether there's dualism or how Neoplatonic it is. And I know like Vervaeke's doing his whole thing about that, but that seems to be where the roads cross, basically, as far as that kind of unified relationship that all these other religions that then are trying to like sort of expand on or tap into. But so I do wonder though how which it's like a majority predominantly Christian space,
Yeah.
how they deal with, I was gonna say like Jacob, Yosef, and me, but Jacob is like is in his own category, I guess, like in that sense. But because there is not a sense of like trying to convert, but specifically with the Jews and the Christians, there is that gap over there where like one has to wonder, okay, what is this conversation? Like I ask this to Yosef sometimes. Like there's
Right.
only
And right. And it comes down to it's like, okay, Israel and the church both exist. And I would not purport to say that they're the same thing. I think I agree. I agree with this distinction that Jensen is making, and I don't think we know the answer. I don't think we know what God's answer is to as to why that is yet. I don't think either side knows. I think it's something that is like I just it's something that we maybe we have intimations of it, but I don't think either side really knows why that is. Why the kingdom is delayed, and why these two traditions that are so like that come from the same root, why they have existed for now 2 millennia on set as separate. Well, not really. That's a little more complicated, but for the sake of easy math, we'll say it's 2 millennia. Although early Christianity and the separation between early Christianity and Judaism, which was much less stark,
Oh,
right?
for sure.
So, but generally, for the sake of ease, we'll say 2 millennia. Like, as to why that is, like why that's what God has chosen to unfold in history, I don't know the answer to that.
Right. So aside from like the sages looking at that being like, they're path makers, this was just like to make things more clear. But I mean, I have, and this relates a little to the alien conversation. I have
Okay,
tried,
then let's go.
I have tried to arm myself in my theological toolkit with how far can I push these bounds of my understanding where I still feel like I am bound to my tradition while still uh grafting in and accepting and including the other. So, in my mind, when I could still have uh Buddhists and Muslims and Christians, I see them all, praying in the temple. And I could see versions of like, Jesus being a prophet, and I could see versions of um uh uh Christianity being like, very, very much like a universal Judaism. And I could see that like there's different, which in my circles would be like, all you're a heretic, that's crazy. That's like, what are you talking about? Like if I was keep talking about this, like where I studied, people would not feel very comfortable with these kind of comments. On the flip side, though, for a Christian, they're like, okay, that's really nice, Hezi, and that's great, but like you're still not fully committing into like our story. And like we have in our own traditions like ways of how reading the New Testament, which how that still gets included as like a mythic interpretation, which I could even say to Christians in my mind, right? As in, like I have, you know, Nate come to the temple to pray with me. I could still say, Nate, you could use the whole exoskeleton of Christianity, as far as I'm concerned. Like, if you need to use those terms and those words and those prayers, it's all good, as long as there's a recognition of, let's say, this gets obviously like much more specific with regards to, the difference between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Is the source just the Father? Are there differences over there? And obviously there's a rub of it. However, I don't believe it requires everyone becoming Jewish or everyone having like one word that they use, or they require from Christians now, or from Raj to remove his head cover. I think his prayer and his conversation with God, like we said, conversation still needs to happen with the jargon and terms that he understands. And in today's world, it could be that for a Christian, he still needs the concept of the rosary, or he still needs the concept of Mary to have that conversation. And it would require some theological tweaking. Um, I also think that it requires that also from the Jew. The Jew needs to realize like where this narrative is coming from, and you can't just like wipe it off and be like, oh, this is nonsense. Like Origin and Tertullian, these people aren't like idiots. They
Right.
were trying to figure things out, obviously, in a very, very deep sense. And it could be that we're not there yet, where we feel like we have to figure out exactly right now what Jesus means to each one of us.
Well,
Um,
Father John Bear. Well, I don't know if you find this useful or not, but Father John Bear, the Orthodox priest and theologian, he said it takes a long time for Adam to become Christ, but he says for Adam to become Christ. So for
Adam to become Christ.
yeah, so for him, it's like there's not a discontinuity between Adam and Christ. It's just a development of the same humanity.
Well, I would say that would be true. That would be true regardless. I mean, we have that in a certain sense. We have that uh, um, David is not supposed to live at all, King David,
Mm-hmm.
and Adam decides to give out of his 1,000 years, he gives 70 years of his lifespan to David. And there's a sense over there which is like, already from Adam, you have like this, already this life has been gifted on to, let's say, the Davidic figure, the Messiah figure,
Right.
which is like, it's all continuous. So um I definitely, I could I could resonate with that sense. I could also resonate with the fact that for all intents and purposes, in your view, in Jesus, you have again a you know, you have man and women becoming one, you have returning to the garden, you really have like, in that sense, like a correction to what happened in in the garden. You have uh you have a response to God asking, "Where are you?" And
Mm-hmm.
like what we say is usually answered by Abraham eventually, like, "Here I am." But again, obviously, in the culmination of Jesus being like being present and here he is, which is that answer again. Um, but my sense is
Well,
it
and
was
that's what,
still
like, I mean, and also with like the Christian idea of the second coming, like this is like there was a one of Zevi's videos that really caught my attention. Was the one, it was one where he talked about an understanding of Messiah as more of a collective, and that resonated with me because um we talk about like the second coming, but the Greek word that we base the idea of the second coming on is parousia. It just means presence. So it's about like, it's not what it is about the presencing of Christ. So that to me allows for an understanding of the second coming, if we want to still use that language to talk about it, as different from the particular life of Jesus of Nazareth, in that it is the realization of the fullness of that mode of being in all of humanity, like
was
collectively.
which I would say in Hebrew it's Bayomahu Hiye Echad Ushmo Echad, and that day his name will be one, right? Which is that recollection of realizing that it's all one. I mean, you could say you're seeing that in Jesus, but the idea would be, fully realizing that. Obviously, we can't realize that. I mean, we've had this conversation once, but in Judaism, this is where evil stems from as well. It's all coming from one. It's all coming from the source, good and evil, all coming from God. And today, obviously, we have this cognitive dissonance. We don't understand. It's hard for us to comprehend how these things are one, and how these things stem from the same place. Uh, so I would also say, as far as like you were mentioning, the second coming is like is a present in Judaism. You have also like Messiah could be like a time period. Definitely the concept of Messiah, son of Joseph. We could see this as the universal or political version of Messiah. So you have rabbis that have dubbed uh, uh, Zionism and Theodor Herzl as these are the vehicles of Messiah, son of Joseph. Uh, like I said, there's been versions of Jesus being seen as, according to some stages, as the Messiah, son of Joseph, and this goes all the way back to original Joseph, right, in Egypt, trying to manifest his father's concepts in Egypt through the Egyptian guard. Ultimately, he fails. That doesn't work out. Moses has to go out and go see in his brother's suffering, which we're going to learn in our Exodus series. But there's an interpretation, which is who are his brothers? Moses is both looking at the Egyptian and at the Israelites and trying to decide, where do I identify?
Mm.
And when he stops the Egyptian from hitting the Israelite, and he buries him in the sand, that is a symbolic burying of the sand of Egypt. I am not taking on my Egyptian form. I'm taking on my Israelite form. I can't bring salvation through the Egyptian garb. And it's also called the Exodus, or in Hebrew, it's called the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus of Egypt. It's not only the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, rather it's an Exodus of Egypt itself from tyranny. Like, I'm taking you out Egypt. I'm taking you out of this this mode. It's also in the Zohar, it mentions that after Israel, Egypt was the most holy of God's people. And later on, the prophet also calls Egypt my people, which he usually only uses for Israel. But there's a sense over there that even the Egyptians had reached a very sophisticated level of theology and understanding with their relations to the gods. But at some point, they went astray. But Joseph, unlike his brother Judah, that did not grow up in the house of Laban, didn't realize that there was an attempt of doing like an integration of a more universal religion with Laban, but that was a fail. And Joseph needs to learn the hard way that it's not going to happen through Egypt. He then asks his brothers and his people, make sure you remove my bones from here, to carry my bones out. And the Zohar mentions that his fear was, if you keep my bones over here, and if I remain in this culture, they will divinize me and they will see me as a god. And the Zohar is sort of like hinting to Jesus in that case, where like there was at some point he was seen as a god and not as what Jesus was supposed to be identified as, a universal savior. Again, like the Judean virgin through David. It failed right now. The Roman occupation, the Second Temple, things are not going well. We're going to redo this again. And we're going to do this through the character of Jesus. So there's been versions like this. And I think with regards to, like you mentioned, like it's a time, it's a period, not necessarily needs to be like one person. I would tend to agree with that I'm not expecting a man necessarily on a horse. I'm anticipating a collective understanding. It could be that there's a man at a certain time, at a certain place, that happens to be a leader that we could identify as leader, but I don't see him as being necessarily the man that has all the answers. Rather,
Right.
it would be
And what would make me still like explicitly Christian is that what I would say is that the what's going to I would say the like the causal energy of that parousia being looking back at this man, Jesus of Nazareth, and seeing that as the full and complete revelation of who this God that we were all seeking after, of who he is. And that his like that his deep and full connection to our humanity is critically important. And I think this is also connected to the mystery of the divine feminine, and why it is so hidden, because ultimately I think that if you were to like force me to say like definitively what the best expression of the divine feminine I would say it's the creation itself, which is why it can't be ever fully separated from God.
Well, again, from a symbolic point of view, this relates obviously to this retraction of God, which, let's say, using your analogy of, using the concept of the feminine, leaves a space, leaves a womb, leaves a place open, a cavern open, for there to be, life in it to start evolving and grow. And so, yes, there definitely is that sense. I mean, in Judaism, it's seen as the Knesset Israel, where like the concept of Israel specifically being like part of like the feminine in a relationship together with God, like we see like in the Song of Songs. So, but I'm with you as far as like the creation itself. um, uh, being that act.
I'm not asking you to go with me all the way. I'm just these are just my own like spiritual intuitions, and this is where I'm led, and like, and I think that's why both in Judaism and Christianity, I think that's why you have the bridal imagery like repeated over and over again. I think that's why it's there. And I also think that's like why like you have the idea of like flesh of my flesh in the marital union, because like if God as pure spirit, well, there's only one thing that God is lacking, and that is body. And the only thing that can give him body is the creation.
And the only thing that could give him body is a
And it,
creation. Right. I would say that, and the next level after that is once you have a body, there's an invitation. There's two routes. There's a natural body, right? There's which is ruled under the sun. The day the sun comes down, the sun comes down. I mean, the sun comes up, the sun comes down, and there's the there are the stars, and we'll call them the angels. There's the rules that we live under in this world,
right,
and then there's an invitation also to be holy, like God is holy. And we are called on to be like, and if you want to partake in this, that's a whole nother relationship that you could take on. And in that sense, you like what we started the conversation with, like you then have this operating system, which is like, okay, now that you are in this natural portion, this natural body that you have on, there's a man, there's a woman, and you could look at procreation as just procreation. However, if you want to do it with your divine glasses on, then you could see two people turning into one, creating life, to this, going back to sort of the creation that God was doing and mimicking that and understanding why you're doing that and the right mindset around that. And that would bring on to like, are you marrying two wives? Are you not marrying two wives? Like all that will start a larger conversation with how to act properly in this world.
right.
And it's definitely an invitation that God's taking us on. And we know uh, to uh, metacho day, right? We have to mimic God's behavior, and that also is an invitation to dig deep and search and see where we could see these echoes, where we could see these fingerprints or patterns of God manifesting Himself, and then us to do act in a similar fashion, which which I mean, and this does in a certain sense lead to Jordan and the culture, because that leads to like, am I looking at any point, do I need to change my lenses, right? Like we'll bring it like this relates to the whole synod conversation with regards to, let's say, the LGBTQ community. How does it fit inside? Like at some point I need to see how that is. That do I need to change my lenses and see how I wasn't looking clearly enough? My lenses were too dirty, and clearly this also, if I just dig deeper, I could see how this is also a pattern of what God is expecting, or no. Am I supposed to be like, no, those are the wrong pair of glasses? Like they're not relevant anymore. And that becomes very confusing when you are told culturally, this is the right thing right now, right? This is something we need to be affirming. And then you have to start asking yourself, okay, like, am I looking at this just through my natural eye, or am I looking at this through my divine piece of glasses, trying to constantly see, am I mimicking God properly? And obviously there's levels to that, right? Like, so like at a very practical sense, you would ask like, okay, Hezi, but in your synagogue, now someone comes to be called up to read from the Torah, but he's a homosexual, right? Can you do that? Right. So then I could start answering like, okay, yes, because I would never embarrass someone like that. Of course, I wouldn't come and shun him, and we should be able to be loving and understanding. Okay. Is this person, can he be the community leader? Is he allowed to be the rabbi? Okay, that's like another level of like how much am I affirming this? How much am I accepting this? These are real questions that we need to ask ourselves. Like, are we moving closer or further away from from mimicking God and trying to manifest and embody how He sees the world? Nate, this conversation could go on much longer.
Yeah, good. I think that's a good no. I like the fact that, and I would that is that particular conversation is one is appropriate, is an appropriate one to leave it as an open question, because I think it is, that's how the conversation sits with us. Like, even if we have strong opinions about it one way or another, we have to admit that like it's an open the reality is that it sits in an open question in our time that we are struggling to deal with. And
I'll just mention how, like, so you have a member of Knesset, of Parliament in Israel, right? Who's ultra Orthodox, who comes out and says that trans and homosexuals are worse than terrorists, and terrorists in Israel is like a really big deal. Now, horrible statement to say. Horrible statement to say. Shouldn't even be said. I know that the guy that said that didn't mean that he thinks trans people and gay people are terrorists. He means, from his understanding and us talking about that grafting, he thinks that would be devastating for the relationship. So he says it would be so devastating because of like the union we're trying to build, and how if a man and a woman and a family is supposed to be representing community, all those things could be challenged by this kind of community. So like it would be sort of devastating, almost potentially worse than an act of one terror. Now, I shouldn't have to be able to steel man his case, so to speak, or explain what he said was horrible. But that would be an example of people struggling with these topics, not having the right tools to do so, and in worse, being at a very high level of power in politics and having misguided ideas about these topics, which could lead to devastating results.
But but it is good. It is good to steel man his case, like, even if you strongly disagree with him, because I think like that's like, I think that is one of the questions that we don't ask enough, as we're just tearing each other apart over disagreements on this particularly sensitive subject. Is very few people are asking the question like, okay, this other perspective that disagrees with me, what is it that they're wanting to take a stand for that they think is good, and how can I make an attempt at least to understand what it is that they think. But because on almost in almost any situation, when you have like two entrenched like camps that are like really embattled, like they're both holding on to something, that's why they're willing to fight about it, but they're also both missing something, which is why they can't come to accord.
I mean, in Hebrew, fighting, war, is called milchama, which comes from the same root of welding, lehalchim. And I believe that, like, that's really should be you could go to battle if you hopefully want the result to be welded. If you want to be, if it ultimately the end, if you find that connection where you guys could then create something new together. And I think it's very difficult. I'm using a different example. When Kanye went on his so to speak anti-Semitic frenzy, and when he was talking to Lex, and he says, when he's talking favorably about Jesus, as a Jew, what I'm seeing is him trying to, in a ill-informed manner, say, as Christians / Jews, wouldn't we also need to try to find the good in Hitler? And the answer is yes. We would also need to do that.
Yeah.
But people, the second they hear Hitler, or let's say that's terrorism, they're like, you just see red. And the question is, can you be like, just move that all away and be like, okay, I see what you're trying to say, and I'm not gonna give up on it. Even on that comment, I'm still going to try to engage on where the truth is coming from. but like I always say, this space needs to be a brave
And
space.
then
It
here's the
should,
thing: as like the good, I've actually because I'm a universalist, and I get in arguments with other Christians who aren't universalists often. This is something I spent a fair amount of time talking. Like, and it's possible that most of what's good about Hitler may not even be Hitler. But the thing like the thing we call Hitler like had other persons that were connected to him, and not every single one of those relationships was bad and worthless. Like at some point, like Hitler was an infant who had a mother who loved her infant.
I mean, this is, in a certain sense, Tony Soprano comes, we see the anti-hero, and everyone's like, I really hope the cops don't catch him. And you're like, what are you talking about? The guy's a mobster. You're
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
he got away.
right. Yeah,
Right. But that allowed us to, that was demanding a little more, a little deeper engagement and thinking from the watcher, from the viewer, to be like, okay, I understand this. I can see the humanity over here. And I guess that's like a little lost, where really it's a hard practice to turn the other cheek, or really try to identify the kernel of truth or goodness or beauty or holiness in someone else's misguided or ill-informed words, which is like goes back to that guy that keeps bothering you about like this little corner, and you're like, why are you here? Because he wants to be here, because he wants help, he wants to be. I mean, you could be like, no, he's just a jerk. There are just jerks, but
mm-hmm.
I sense that those people are they're
But
very
they're
lucky that.
staying. They don't. But the ones that don't go away and just like go do something else, they're staying engaged for a reason. So they must see something of value in what's going on, or they wouldn't keep paying attention.
So that's in a certain sense what I mean, why I don't mind that Jacob calls me a heretic, because it's white noise in the end of the day for me. I'm trying to identify the things that I see as genuine, where I can be like, okay, this, like, that's what he
Right.
meant with this comment. And and that doesn't mean that his comments won't get him in trouble, or they can't cause damage. It's just I decide to not have let that be the narrative that clouds my thought, or guides me, or with that's not the deciding factor for me to, the equation, which is Jacob, to be like, oh, it must mean I have to see him in this frame. I have the options to interpret things differently, and I have options to interpret things differently in certain cases, which I've mentioned to some Christians here in the past. Is in Judaism, I and it could be that you have this tradition in Christianity as well. I have a lot more flexibility to be like, okay, these are what the Spaniard Jews think. This is what, or let's in your case, I'm Greek Orthodox, but now I have an issue. But
I'm Anglican, by the way.
the way the Unitarians will deal with this, they have an answer for this. That's all fair game. I could search for sources and answers within a wide range of traditions within Judaism, because as long as like I'm still within, let's say, that guideline or that border, I'm still all good. So
Do you ever go through the exercise? Let's say when Jacob was calling you a heretic, do you ever go through the exercise of like, okay, I'm going to put myself in Jacob's perspective to the best of my ability here and try to understand like why he feel like I don't feel like I'm a heretic, but why does he think I'm a heretic? And is there something good that Jacob is trying to stand for when he calls me a heretic?
yeah, so I do that exercise, and I did it recently actually. Jacob was going on and on about how, like, even writing the word God, like he doesn't even write God, he just has G dash D.
Mhm.
And I was going on for a few minutes just explaining like where is Jacob's position coming from, and understanding like why it's so important for him to say it that way. And while I disagree with him, I think it goes overboard. His general concept and his idea about that is very admirable, and like we should understand like why he says that, where he's coming from. Now, what I would hope by saying that is anyone hearing Jacob going on his like don't write God's name rant would be like, I just need to like, I understand where he's coming from, so I'm just gonna like, he's gonna go on for 5 minutes about this, and that's all good. And I understand like he means X, and there's a good place to understand why he
But
means
being in that
X.
place of being able to understand, like, I think, like, and that's like being in that place of being able to understand, like, why, even when someone has a negative, like, is saying something negative about you, being able to put yourself in the place of understanding, like, okay, this is why this person thinks that. Doesn't that somehow make it like less painful?
Totally. And I must end on this example, but my partner and I get very nervous. I have a client coming right now, and we did a fantastic job, and I'm sure they're going to be very happy. But my partner hates this when we talk before a client comes. I'm like, okay, this is what they're going to challenge us about. And he's like, I can't stand when you do this. I'm like, okay, we're walking through the house. He's going to say this corner looks like shit. And then my partner's like, no, he's not. He's going to X, Y, Z. I'm like, no, why can't he demand and say, this is what I wanted. This was the paint spec. Why does this corner look like this? So my partner comes and says, like, well, because he wanted to use X paint and this corner was more difficult. I'm like, okay, that's a good answer. And that's what we'll say. But I'm not just accepting it because you say X. I want to put myself in the client's shoes, and I'm going to be the dick client that's, excuse me for the language, I'm going to be
No,
the
it's
dirt
fine.
client that that is demanding everything he thinks he's not yelling. Like, I'm not giving an example where my client decides to fall on the floor and start crying. I'm giving examples, real examples, but if I was a client and I thought I paid for this finish and this is what you showed me, my first reaction would be like, what the hell is this? Now you might have a good answer, but I want you to feel the pressure, because that's why I'm nervous right now, because I'm assuming that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was too quick on finishing this. Maybe I said like this is going to be okay, but it's not okay. And I want to put myself in that position. But ultimately, when I'm having the conversation with the client, I'm loosey goosey, because I did that already. I had the conversation. I challenged myself. I really challenged myself, where I want to hear the client, my partner, say, he's like, Chezi, listen, if he really pushes us on that, then we'll tell him, no problem, we'll fix it and we'll pay for it. I'm like, good. I want to know that that's the result in the end of the day, because that goes full circle. Client, guess what? If that really bothers you, I understand why. I think that's not necessary, but I totally understand where you're coming from. And if it bothers you, then the reality that you want, that I understand, will come to fruition, which means you won't have to pay for it. We'll take care of it because I understand you. And logically, then, if I understand you, this is what would need to happen. So I really think that is, and that relates to like the steel manning practice. I think it's extremely important. And our sages, the famous schools of Hillel and Shammai, Hillel, who was more lenient, always would first steel man the position of Shammai to make sure his students fully understand what the other school of thought thinks, give it its best day in the sun, and only then will we make our verdict whether or not. And in the Shammai school, they did not do so. They would not teach the Hillelian school of thought. So I think that also gave him uh, uh, more legitimacy when he did that, when he really had to battle with the other ideas. On that note, sir, I hope we have many more productive
Oh,
battles
this was
with those.
fantastic, Hezi. Thank you for joining me.
We'll talk.
Yep.